understand Rahu and Ketu, the nodes in Taurus and Scorpio, we should begin by making sure we understand Rahu and Ketu. And in order to do that, we should figure out what they actually astronomically are. So let's put a diagram on the screen. We'll start with this little symbol here representing the Earth. And around the Earth, we'll draw the apparent orbit of the Sun, which defines the ecliptical plane. Also, we should draw the orbit, or the apparent orbit, of the Moon around the Earth. Now, when you look at this diagram, you can see that the two paths, the Sun's path and the Moon's path, they cross each other at two particular points. And those points are the nodes, which we name Rahu and Ketu. You notice the direction of the Moon is different at each node. On the top of the diagram, the Moon is moving up, it's moving higher than the ecliptic. And on the bottom, the Moon is moving down lower. This is why one of the nodes is called the ascending node and the other is called the descending, or the northerly node or the southerly node. So the northerly or ascending node is what in Vedic astrology is called Rahu, and the descending or southerly node is called Ketu. Now, once you understand this, you can pretty easily make all the sense you need to make out of what Rahu and Ketu symbolize in astrology. Because fundamentally, Rahu is all about up, ascending, getting bigger, and Ketu is all about down, descending. So by up, we mean going high, getting amplified, and getting bigger. And by down, we mean getting deeper, becoming more compressed, or contracted, getting smaller. Up in this diagram also signifies coming out, because coming up north of the ecliptic plane, you're coming into the daylight side of the universe. So you're coming out into the visible world. Rahu therefore signifies outwardness, extroversion, and externals. This is why Rahu is associated with externalism or worldlyism, worldliness, materialism. Ketu, on the other hand, it's where the Moon is crossing the Sun's orbit, going down, going into it, going into hiding, going into the night hemisphere of the universe. And so Ketu symbolizes in and inwardness. This is why it's introversive, quiet, shy, reserved, and it signifies internal things, psychological things, spiritual things. Finally, up and out is associated with progress. So Rahu has to do with going forward, time moving forward, and it has to do with the future and things making progress, things changing forward. Whereas Ketu is the opposite. It's about things moving backwards, the past, and returning to the way things were. This is almost everything that Rahu and Ketu symbolize in astrology, but one really big thing is missing. And that has to do with the astronomical fact that where the Moon crosses the Sun's orbit is the spot where an eclipse can happen. That's why the Sun's orbit is called the ecliptic. So Rahu and Ketu are the points where the eclipses happen, so they signify the things that eclipses signify. Eclipses are radical changes, and this is key to understanding what both of the nodes signify. They signify change. That's why they are all about instability. Uncertain, unpredictable, unforeseen, sudden, radical change, which is fearsome and chaotic. And because of this unforeseeable sudden change, something you're not prepared for, something you can't deal with because you didn't see it coming, that's why Rahu and Ketu also symbolize inevitability, stuff you can't do anything about. And that's why they're very, very important in anything relating to obsessions, compulsions, and addictions. Now let's talk about what they represent when they're in Taurus and Scorpio. So what we want to ask ourselves is, what is synergistic about Taurus and Scorpio? The first thing is that they're both fixed signs. They're not cardinal, they're not dual, they're both fixed. And fixed mode has a forte with things that require dedication and commitment. So that's something we have to bear in mind. The other thing that's synergistic about Taurus and Scorpio is that there's something synergistic about the elements. Earth from Taurus and water from Scorpio. The combination brings fertility. So since Rahu and Ketu will exaggerate, amplify, or intensify things, when they're in Taurus and Scorpio, they're amplifying these good things, these synergies. So we expect natives with Rahu and Ketu in Taurus or Scorpio to be deep and very committed and very fruitful. Or in other words, they're very productive. They're not wishy-washy at all, and they're not superficial at all. But on the other hand, we also have to ask ourselves what is not synergistic about these two signs. What clashes between Taurus and Scorpio? And it's the elements, actually. Even though earth and water together produce fertility, there's something about earth which is antithetical to something about water, and that's the fact that earth is very solid and water is very fluid. So now, if you watched last week's video about Aries and Taurus, you may be asking, wait a minute, in Aries and Taurus you said that the clash was usness of Venus versus meanness of Mars. Why aren't you saying that here? Because Scorpio belongs to Mars and Taurus belongs to Venus. This issue of us versus me, which is the duality for Aries Libra nodes, is not the duality for Taurus Scorpio nodes, because Taurus and Scorpio are not both cardinal like Aries and Libra. They're both fixed. And fixed signs, their forte, their asset, is commitment and dedication. So they don't tend to have problems with relationships. So really, the clash between Taurus and Scorpio is the solidness or practicality or realness of earth versus the fluidity or feeliness of water. And again, Rahu Ketu will amplify and intensify things. So when they're here in Taurus and Scorpio, they're going to amplify or intensify this clash. And this is where the challenge comes. You get this challenge of perceiving a hard duality between earthy things and watery things. So I'm going to note 4 important ways in which this can be specific. Practicality from earth versus emotional nature from water. People with nodes in Taurus and Scorpio will see a hard duality between things that are emotional and things that are practical, and they will highly favor one over the other. Another thing is rationality versus intuition. Earth is very objective and water is very intuitive. So when there's a clash between earth and water, you're getting a clash between rational objective thinking and intuitive emotional thinking. And people with the nodes here are thinking that these are two very different things, and I like A and I don't like B. Another way of expressing this in a specific way is that earth is very real and water is very imaginative. So another duality here is reality versus fantasy. And a final way to express it is materiality, materialness versus spirituality. So if you have the nodes in Taurus and Scorpio, you are going to be weakened insofar as you buy into the concept of the duality between these things. But once you cease to buy that duality and start to integrate them and unify this apparent duality, then you become empowered by having your nodes in Taurus and Scorpio. So what they all boil down to is the clash between substance versus form, the duality of substance to form, and the resolution to the apparent duality between substance and form is to realize that form is generated by substance. My life force generated my body. And conversely, form expresses and empowers the substance. My life force generated this body so that it could exist and be real and have an effect and experience the world. My form empowers my substance, and my substance empowers my form. When you see things that way in terms of these four issues, then you become very, very excellent and empowered with those things. But when you don't see it that way, but you dualize the things, you become very handicapped. To explain this more thoroughly, let's look at actual people who have the nodes in Taurus and Scorpio. So people who have mastered the practical versus emotional thing, those will be people who have few problems in their relationships, and I'll explain why. It's because a common problem in relationships is to value either the form or the substance, so either the emotion or the expression. Some people only focus on expression, and they think that the expression of itself should verify the existence of the emotion. But it doesn't. Like, in other words, just because you bought somebody a present doesn't mean you actually care about them at all. It just maybe means you wanted to check something off your checklist and get it done and move on to the next thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's people that think they shouldn't have to do anything because they feel so strongly and they shouldn't have to express their feelings. So people who have mastered that apparent duality, they have very good relationships because they realize that their feelings have to be expressed in concrete words and deeds and actions. They buy presents with great care, for example. So we don't really have lists of famous people who are famously good at buying presents for each other, so we're not going to really call up celebrities with those names, but we can go and we can look at the next one. Rational versus intuitive. When people who have mastered this, they become great thinkers. With Rahu in Taurus, we have Martin Luther King, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and with Rahu in Scorpio, we have Darwin, Copernicus, and Fermi. Now, up till now, I haven't really said anything about the difference between whether or not Rahu is in Taurus or if it's in Scorpio. I've just sort of talked about it as if it's all the same, because by and by, it is the same. The one thing that will be different is which side of the duality tends to be the native's natural focus, which side of the duality they tend to prefer. Generally, it's the Rahu placement, which is the sign that we want more of, because Rahu likes things to be bigger. And Ketu placement is the thing we want less of, because Ketu wants things to be smaller. So you can see that at work here with these philosophers. The people who had Rahu in Taurus, the earthy sign, they're more social, practical thinkers. Whereas the people who had Rahu in Scorpio, they're the theoretical scientists. Now, if we look at the third duality on the list, reality versus fantasy, if you master this, you become a very good storyteller. And sure enough, there's a long list of authors with the nodes in Taurus and Scorpio. For example, with Taurus Rahu, we have Tolkien, Stephen King, Mark Twain, Oscar Wilde, Balzac, and Rimbaud. And with Rahu in Scorpio, we have Poe, Kafka, Bukowski, Coppola, and Walt Disney. Again, you can see the difference. If Rahu is in the earth sign, you have the authors that are more realistic and focus on more everyday, day-to-day topics. Whereas if you have the north node in Scorpio, you have the authors that are more like fantasy. However, there's at least one name on each list which is kind of interesting and we should speak about for a second. Tolkien, for example. Tolkien is with the north node in Taurus, but he was the author, or kind of the genre pioneer for high fantasy. Well, the thing about Tolkien which made him unique was, and the reason why he pioneered that, was because he was the first person to take fantasy and treat it with the care as if it was real. Make it realistic, make maps of it, make backstories for it, make actual languages for it. So his strong point isn't really the fantasy, it's the realism that he put into the fantasy. And furthermore, his whole theme is the glorification of the Hobbit, which is the realistic, practical, everyday Taurian type of a creature. And on the other side of the list, you have Bukowski, Charles Bukowski. He seems to be very much a writer about everyday things, like just plain old sex. But his treatment of the subject is highly fantastical. All right, and then finally, the last thing on the list is material versus spiritual. If you master that duality, then you become obviously a great spiritualist or a mystic or something like that, whatever you want to call it. So we have many people who are well-known mystics, spiritualists with the nodes in Taurus and Scorpio. So, for example, with Rahu and Taurus, you have Yogananda Paramahansa, you have Immanuel Kant, Eckhart Tolle, Anton LaVey, and L. Ron Hubbard. Whereas with Rahu in Scorpio, there's not as many, but you do have Sadhguru and John Paul the Pope, John Paul II. So the thing about spiritualism, which is very interesting, is the weighting has flipped. With Rahu and Taurus, we find the people that are more mystical or watery, even though Taurus is the earth sign. Whereas with Rahu and Scorpio, we find the people who are more practical or earthy, even though Scorpio is the water sign. The reason for that is that Scorpio and Ketu have a tremendous affinity or synergy when it comes to mysticism and spirituality. Hence, for the topic of material versus spiritual, Taurian Rahu is much more productive on this topic. So if you want to know my interpretations for your Rahu and Ketu in your signs, and your Rahu Ketu houses, and your signs and houses and aspects and yogas and everything for all the planets and everything in your chart, go to my website, please, victikara.com, and click over to the reports section. I recommend starting with the complete birth chart overview. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week for the nodes in Sagittarius and Gemini.